Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first webinar of season 5. Tonight is our 81st session. Can you believe that? 81 webinars. And tonight we have a returning guest, a guest who is so good we ask him to return again and again and again. So it's the third time that Richard is joining us, and but there's a double act tonight, so we've got Ian and Rich. So I'm handing straight over to the two of you, Ian and Rich.
Okay, so welcome to Compassionate Inquiry into Addiction. We're going to speak from personal and professional experience today. So my name's Ian. I'm a social worker.
My name's Rich, and I'm a social worker as well.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay. So here we go. So compassionate inquiry into addiction. So I thought what would be good is us to look at the anatomy of compassion, and it has some quite interesting Latin roots. So the Latin origins of the word compassion is pati, which means to suffer. And the prefix for com, meaning with, together, in association, completely, also occurring from Latin. So compassion literally means to suffer with, okay? And the connection of suffering with another person brings compassion beyond sympathy and into the realms of empathy. So for the doors of compassion to be open, one must be willing to learn about the suffering of another and be willing to feel the necessary feelings to evolve into that new awareness of how somebody else is experiencing something. And, you know, barriers to compassion can sometimes be a survival strategy to feeling and experiencing what we don't always want to feel. And sometimes that's a barrier to understanding people and a driver for stigma and marginalization and criminalization, which are some of the barriers to recovery for people living with addiction. And it's, you know, that can be part of our own denial, and also denial is a mechanism for people living with addiction, which is a psychological coping strategy designed to keep people emotionally stable in unstable times. So, you know, our thinking, or aka ego, sometimes prevents us from going on the journey of feeling certain feelings because we don't want to take that emotional risk. Mm-hmm. So before we start, I guess what we want to do is just invite you to try and listen with an open heart and just try and step into some vulnerability if you can, whether it's cake or crack or whatever it is.
So we're going to give a kind of brief overview about our relationship to this topic and how we know what we know, because we wanted to be clear that we're not coming from this topic from an unbiased perspective.
Yeah. Epistemic humility.
Epistemic humility is the word that I said to Ian when we were preparing for this that we should use the word epistemic humility.
We're going to look great if we drop them lyrics.
He said, that sounds beautiful. What does it mean? And I had to Google it. So I knew what it meant, but I knew the context it went in, but I didn't know what it meant. So I'm going to talk about some of my own experiences, and I'll just begin with an entry from my dad's diary at one point during my childhood, and I'll just read it out here. And it's a short entry. He wrote, "Woke up feeling very scared, was very emotional and anxious for over 1 hour. Then I remembered I had a can of beer, drank that, and it receded my fears long enough to get to the chemist to pick up Valium." And so in this very kind of short entry, it really encapsulates the kind of suffering and anxiety and emotional distress that he was experiencing from the existence of being, from the existence of day-to-day life. And so my dad, when I was growing up, spent the second half of my childhood using alcohol, cannabis, heroin, methadone, Valium, and diazepam. And so when I was growing up, I would witness my dad purchase, prepare, and consume drugs. And despite that, I didn't really understand the morality of what he was doing. It was just simply what he did. And I didn't really have a judgment about it. Now, that isn't to say that it didn't affect me, because he began using when I was 8 or 9, and my life prior to his demise into self-sabotage, self-loathing, shame and addiction was characterised by love, stability and a degree of innocence. But the events following my dad's relapse would change that. And what happened was that the love and the care and attention he'd showed me up until that point slowly and increasingly withered away as he was swallowed up by the addiction that had plagued him all of his adult life, except for the several years he achieved abstinence when I was born. So at 16 years old, my dad died. He was 49 years old. To me, psychologically at least, my dad died 1,000 times before he physically died. Whenever I approached him or sought comfort or attention from the ages of 8 until he died when I was 16, he would be unavailable or rejected, and I would our relationship would suffer a blow. And so to cope with the rejection and the loss of my dad, I closed down emotionally. I sought to suppress all of my negative feelings because I'd associated intimacy with pain and rejection. And so because of the pain and rejection that characterized my relationships with my parents, I'd assumed at an unconscious level that those feelings would be a feature of all intimate relationships. And so soon after my dad died, I began experimenting with drugs, and I instantly found great relief and solace in taking alcohol and drugs. I'd been suppressing all my negative feelings psychologically, but now I had access to a substance that would do a far more effective job than I could. I didn't have to suppress or confront the unbearable feelings associated with the rejection, the loss, and the feelings of worthlessness and inadequacy that stem from having your feelings unintentionally dismissed by your parents. And so I could drink some alcohol and take some drugs, and all of the internal psychological distress would disappear into the background. So and at the time, some of my friends would use drugs as well, but in a very different way. And for them, it was to enhance an experience, and they would use it intermittently or sporadically, whereas for me it defined my experience, and I very quickly depended on them. So that's a little bit about my background and my journey, and so I'll hand over to Ian who will give an introduction to his.
Thanks, Richard. So the perspective I'm operating from, is my name is Ian and I'm an addict. So I'm in recovery. I've been in abstinence-based recovery for coming up 9 years now. And, for me, addiction is, it's an attempt to seek connection on my terms, because the terms I was exposed to as a child harm me, and, as long back as I can remember, I was looking outside of myself to feel better, I couldn't self-regulate. I was looking for the solution outside of myself. And, even at school, I thought all the kids got took to one side and was told, this is the secret for living life, but whatever you do, don't tell you. And I thought there's this class, this book, this lesson, and this piece of information they all got that I didn't. And I now know that I had this sort of predisposition within myself that I was projecting onto the world around me. And, as far back as I can remember, I was in foster care. I was a looked after child, and I lived with about 20 foster families, several children's homes, 6 prison sentences, 3.5 years behind the door in 10 prisons, and 5 drug rehabs. So I did a bit of research, and what I learned was that addiction is about an obsession of the mind. An obsession is a thought that excludes all other thoughts and then creates a compulsion to act out on that obsession. Enslaved to it again and again and again. Think, do, think, do, think, do, And I become a human doing rather than being, And I started taking drugs at the age of 10. And then I got into recovery in my early 20s, and thank God, And, I could write a book on, what drugs I took and where, but I think what's really important is where it took me, really. When I was 21, I was in a police station in Brighton. I was about 8 stone in weight, and I'm 6'1", so that's very malnourished. I hadn't washed or changed my clothes for weeks. you know, I was begging outside Brighton train station, injecting, you know, heroin and crack cocaine in multi-storey car parks where I would sleep sometimes. I have I can remember, you know, experiences where I would just break down in tears, uncontrollably sobbing whilst injecting drugs, not knowing why I couldn't stop, not knowing why I couldn't stop hurting all these people. And, you know, I was watching myself slowly commit suicide. And I wasn't enjoying myself. I wasn't having fun. I couldn't bear to be alive without a sense of relief from my suffering. And it's like, you know, you can see the madness of the journey, but you can't understand the purpose of it. And I sold my soul. I gave up my dignity. I gave up any values I had, any hopes, ambition, any integrity, any relationships. You know, I'd abandoned the human being within. And you know, at 21, I was done. You know, I was in a bad way, and I used to write myself letters when I was like after a 3 or 4 day bender and of not sleeping and hallucinating and telling myself, you really need to get help when you wake up, and send reminders on my phone. And then, you know, when I'd come round and I'd find those, the obsession to use was so strong that I'd disregard that, and I'd be just pulled again and again and again. And that's the soul destroying part of addiction. You know, you feel like you're using against your will, and everybody just hates you for it, you know. And I was in this police station for nicking DVD box sets. It wasn't glamorous, you know. And I was in front of a solicitor who, by now I'd been arrested 35 times, and no one ever really sat me down and said, why are you doing this, Ian, and how can we help you stop, you know? And I remember this solicitor spoke to me with kind, warm and endearing language. It's been said that sort of language is the adhesive that binds culture and relationships, and I really like that idea. And she called me words like sweetheart, love and darling. And to set the scene, you know, I'd been injecting a lot of heroin in my arms and my veins were disappearing. I was going in my hands and they were just really unpleasant to look at, and I stunk. But here was this woman being kind to me, you know. And there's a book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and there's a wonderful line in it. It says that when compassion is present, then we're able to see the truth. Mm-hmm. And my ego had constructed itself in a way and strategized itself in a way to protect me from, you know, the legalistic, draconian, Victorian perspective of the criminal justice system that doesn't know how to respond to addiction. And here I have a solicitor being so nice to me. And she said to me, Ian, sweetheart, why are you living like this? And I remember I took this deep breath and I sat back in this chair, not this chair, another chair. You bloody miracle. This chair's been everywhere with me. I sat back in the chair and I said, I don't want to live like this anymore, you know. And I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders and I surrendered. And we, you know, I'm part of a community of many inspiring people who manage to overcome and live with addiction. And, you know, we have this idea that you need to surrender to win. You need to stop fighting and trying to control, and a catalogue of failed events. So that's who I am, or part of my story. And I'm speaking from experience, someone that's recovering from addiction, and I live as a recovering addict. And you know, my family, there was addiction in my family. God bless my mum. She passed away as a result of this stuff. And I've got an uncle and the same, and a sister I love dearly who I watch through a powerless lens. So, you know, addiction is part of our lives in multiple ways. And we just, for the epistemic humility, we're sounding really intellectual there, we just want to own that, really, and be honest and transparent about our position. Hopefully that will touch somebody's heart and they can meet us there. Right. There we go. So I think we can probably agree that there are many misconceptions about drugs and drug addiction. And these are the sort of two main ones that I come across frequently. So drugs are addictive. That's not true. it's a myth that drugs are addictive. And I know that challenges everything we think we know about drug addiction. So I'm going to try and, validate that statement. So if drugs were addictive, then anyone who ever took a drug would be a drug addict. Okay, like alcohol. If alcohol doesn't cause alcoholism, because if alcohol was addictive, then anyone who ever took a drink would be an alcoholic, right? And I'm sure lots of people on this call, all 136 of you have, the majority of you probably have had a drink in your life, and and we know cake doesn't cause addiction, but some people get carried away with that, right? So we have to ask ourselves, if drugs don't cause addiction, because not everyone who takes a drug becomes a drug addict, then why is one susceptible to addiction? And this is the question we need to ask ourselves. And for me, it has a relationship with my pain and my experiences, and a need to look outside of myself to self-soothe. And we'll look at like heroin and love in a bit. So the next part is addiction is a bad life choice. So there's this kind of idea that it's an ethical dilemma or a moral deficiency, a series of bad choices, and the use of gateway drugs. Well, I can talk to you about the obsession and compulsion beyond my mental control, crying in the car park, not being able to stop my using. It's like this. If somebody kidnapped me tomorrow, starved me, incarcerated me, and injected me with drugs with dirty needles, made me eat out of bins, sleep in car parks, beat me up, exploited me, and made me sell my soul. If someone kidnapped me and did that to me, I'd probably have to kill them if I made it out alive. So at what point did it become okay for me to treat myself like that? At what point did I give myself permission to treat myself like that? And that is much more sophisticated and complex than a bad life choice.
So we're going to look through a few causes or misconceptions of addiction that have been identified by Gabor Mate in his brilliant book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And he recalls his experience of being a doctor prescribing patients with morphine, which is essentially a pure medicalized version of heroin. And he details that his patients would take high amounts of morphine as a pain relief until there was an alternative to the pain. And the patient would then no longer be prescribed the heroin. And there would be very little fallout from this. And so it kind of signifies that it's not just the substance that makes the individuals addicted. As quipped by Johann Hari in his brilliant talk on this subject, brilliant TED talk, he said, when your grandmother has a hip replacement and was administered morphine, she didn't come out as a junkie, did she? And then Mate kind of refers to two studies. One was the rat park experiment, whereby two rats were placed into a cage and they were given water and cocaine. And what was found was that the rats would repeatedly take the cocaine, often until they became so unwell that they then eventually died. And on the back of that experiment, scientific experiment, there was a large-scale public health campaign. But then there was another scientist, Dr. Bruce Alexander, who came along, and he did this. He ran the same experiment. He put rats in a cage, and he gave them water, and he gave them cocaine. But this time, he put them in a rat with other rats. He gave them so that there was female and male, so they could have partners and have sex with one another. There was a little spinning wheel, so they had something to do, and they were well nourished and well looked after. And in this context, none of the rats took the cocaine compulsively or even habitually. They took it intermittently and occasionally. None of them became addicted, and certainly none of them died. And then Mate also refers to the Vietnam War, where 20% of the American troops were using heroin on a regular basis when they were out in service in Vietnam. And there was a lot of concern at the time that kind of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of troops were going to be returning to America after they'd fulfilled their duties with problematic and severe addiction. But actually what they found is that when they returned home and they were with their families, with their home, in a safe context, not in a war-torn environment, almost all of them stopped using heroin. I think they found that perhaps 1% of them continued to have an issue with their substance misuse. And so these arguments against the causes of addiction being that the drugs are inherently addictive and it's a moral failing of the individual leads Gabor to conclude that drugs don't make anyone into an addict any more than food makes a person into a compulsive eater. He argues that there has to be a pre-existing vulnerability. Now, it's important to say he's not saying that there isn't an addictive quality to them if you take them for a sustained period of time, but he's arguing that there's more important factors that are underpinning the reasons for why people become addicted.
And this is the thing with addiction. We're not saying, and it depends on how you define addiction or whether you believe drugs are addictive or not. Because yes, if you give someone morphine for a period of time, it becomes a physical dependency. But addiction isn't defined solely by the body requiring what it's become dependent on. Addiction is in the brain and the thinking as well, which actually moves us on nicely to the next aspect. Okay, so there's,
So this is Gabor Mate again defining addiction, and I'll just read this out quickly. Addiction is any repeated behaviour, substance related or not, in which a person feels compelled to persist regardless of its negative impact on his life and the lives of others. So addiction has 4 components. Firstly, it's compulsive engagement with the behaviour, a preoccupation with it. Secondly, impaired control over the behaviour. Thirdly, persistence or relapse despite evidence of harm. And finally, dissatisfaction, irritability, or intense craving when the object, be it drug, activity, or other goal, is not immediately available.
Okay. Now, so when I did my social work degree, I think there was one day that had a focus on addiction. In terms of the training, and if we think systemically, you know, the addiction features into a lot of reasons why social work are there, right? It may not be directly, but I've worked in fostering for 10 years, and if addiction didn't exist, I think our jobs would be redundant almost, you know. And I think that what we need to do is, you know, but there's a lot of ideas about addiction and individuals who are addicted, and there's a lot of opinions and perspectives that probably aren't conducive to understanding people entirely. And, you know, if you think about the Rat Park, you know, a lot, and the Vietnam, there was a huge a strong relationship between environment and behavior, and how people's behavior changed as a result of environment, okay? Now, there's this thing called the Biopsychosocial Model, and I know it sounds quite esoteric on the face of it, but actually we're going to try and deconstruct it. So basically, you know, look at a plant, right? Now, if you think of a plant and it starts, you know, going brown and shriveled up and dying, we don't go, bloody hell, that plant has a moral deficiency or an ethical dilemma, or that plant is making bad plant life choices. You know, we think about the soil, we think about irrigation, we think about sunlight, and we consider the environment that the plant is in, and recognize that the environment is the reason why the plant isn't nourishing as it should. And people are the same, and so is the brain. You know, if we place a baby in an incubator without human touch and affection, but give the baby a nutritious diet in order to aid physical development, parts of the baby's brain won't develop, and in more serious cases, you know, the baby could die. Now, this is called the biopsychosocial model, where the biology of the brain is impacted by psychological and sociological factors. Okay, so the environment impacts the way the biology of the brain develops, the shape, the neurological pathways, and how it kind of develops into a human being. The brain isn't a human, but it's an organ, right? So we know that the brain impacted by psychological and sociological factors. Now, heroin is an attempt for love. Oxytocin is known for the hormone of love. trust, feeling warmth and connected. And when you pick up a baby and you go, oh, or like a puppy, you go, oh, that's oxytocin and dopamine being released in your brain, because it's designed to make sure we love and nurture and build healthy attachments. Now, if you speak to people who have been addicted to heroin and you say, what was it like when you first took heroin? They say it was like a warm, soft hug. It was a warm, soft blanket. And if you make inquiries into people's lives, there's always a story of separation, loss, and abandonment. And there can be a logical connection between people abusing drugs and an example of that. Okay, so what we're saying is that that addiction is an attempt to fulfill a need that perhaps hasn't been met earlier on in life.
And just to kind of continue on from the point that Ian was making, in the context of safe and nurturing care, a child learns that the attachment relationship can be a resource for comfort and protection. And over time, the child will develop the capacity to regulate their emotions using relationships as an effective means to do so. However, in the absence of protective and comforting caregiving, a child will experience a high level of stress, and that then in turn impacts upon their brain development, altering the way a child relates to his inner world and the value that can be derived from relationships with others. So many drugs are effective because they artificially create satisfying emotional states that typically derive from being well connected to others, or because they numb out the psychological distress caused by fractured or abusive relationships. And so when I reflect on my own experiences, my dad and I had completely different experiences, but the extent of our drug use was significantly different. I would argue the intensity was related to the severity of the adversity we'd endured, but we both used them to deal with our internal landscape in the absence of a relational support system that could mitigate against the kind of psychological distress. There's one more point I'd like to make, which is around, not only did my experiences cause me a degree of sadness and emotional pain, but they also led to the development of a strategy that closed me off emotionally, especially within close relationships. So this deprived me of access to genuine connections with others, even when it was available. So even when I was no longer in the caregiving context that necessitated me to have the strategy, when I went to college and I was in university, my relationships became more rewarding and more engaging. But at that point, I'd already developed the strategy of being closed down. And so Mate kind of captures this beautifully in a quote that I'll just read out here, which is, "The greatest damage done by neglect, trauma, or emotional loss is not the immediate pain they inflict, but the long-term distortions they induce in a way a developing child will continue to interpret the world and her situation in it." So I had limited access to the kind of biochemical and emotional sustenance that's available through relationships. And so it wasn't, when I look back, it wasn't like I was ignorant to the adverse effects of the substances that I was using. I was relatively educated about the harms and the associated difficulties, but it was a trade-off at that time that I was willing to make. In addition to the biological and psychological and childhood factors, Gabor Mate also refers to the impact of society more broadly. And again, he goes back to Dr. Bruce Alexander, who argued that the precursor of addiction is dislocation, and that only the chronically and severely dislocated people are vulnerable to addiction. Johann Hari wrote an interesting book called Lost Connections, around which are around the reasons for depression and anxiety, and he identifies several facets of disconnection. Disconnection from work, other people, meaningful values, childhood trauma, status and respect, the natural world, and a hopeful and secure future. And I think those forms of disconnection map on quite nicely to some of the underpinnings, socially speaking, of addiction.
So, you know, and this is about how we then reshape the narrative of, you know, human beings who are suffering with addiction. And this is a contentious issue for social work. And I think, you know, so if a baby's biological brain development is severely affected by confinement with limited or no human connection, what do we expect to happen when we incarcerate people for suffering with addiction? Because that's more of the same thing that caused the issue in the first place, more disconnection. You know, I spent 3.5 years of my life in prison, and I can tell you that the way I had to behave, which was conducive to my survival, was not conducive to legitimate connection, authenticity through the path of vulnerable conversations. I couldn't rock up to the breakfast table and say, I feel really unworthy of receiving love today, when that was the behavior that was driving that was the belief system that was driving all my behavior. So what happens is, socially, you know, societally, you know, we reject people from society, we confirm all the negative belief systems they have about themselves, which is the engine that's driving that behavior, and it perpetuates itself. And the brain is just responding to its environment. And that's why when we do interventions with people and we get alongside them, we need to have these sociological perspectives and these broader insights that need to feature into our assessments and interventions when we're thinking systemically about supporting people.
So the war on drugs has been called by an affective neuroscience as cultural schizophrenia.
Quite fitting.
And it's because the reason why he uses that term is because it reflects what Ian was just talking about, in that the solution, or the proposed solution, and the enacted solution to eradicating or reducing drug addiction is almost it's creating the exact kind of conditions that exasperate and make it more difficult, not less difficult. And the current approach to the issue of drug consumption depends on pathologizing any kind of drug use.
Yeah.
And so that happens mainly by making it illegal, so that the legal consequences will deter anyone tempted to use the drug. And so anyone that continues to use drugs will be criminalized. Thus, the theory goes that they'd eventually decide that it isn't worth it. But that premise is underpinned by this false idea that those who take drugs are freely choosing to take them for their enjoyment. And should the consequences be severe enough, that they will be deterred from making them. And this kind of perspective assumes that choices are made in a social and political vacuum by individuals who have no developmental experiences that have indelibly shaped their psychological and neurophysiological functioning. But Matty points out that the decisions that we believe that are freely made are manifestations of our unconscious beliefs or emotions. So the war on drugs, we would argue, and it is evidently ineffective, because when we criminalize, stigmatize, and morally condemn the most vulnerable members of our society for self-medicating, we decrease the possibility of connection and create the conditions that keep them trapped on drug dependency. There's a really good book by Neil Wood, who is an ex-policeman who worked undercover infiltrating drug gangs, and he documents his experience of being a quite naive, idealistic policeman wanting to go after drug users and drug dealers, and through a process of doing that job over several years, begins to realise the futility of the approach that he's adopting. And actually what he realised was that as the police developed more sophisticated ways of capturing criminals, the criminals just increased their level of sophistication in executing the drug dealing, and the way that they interacted with drug users became much more violent and much more aggressive.
So just on that, I think also, if we're thinking more of a systems perspective, there is a strong relationship between the war on drugs, globalization, and neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, and it's quite ironic. So neoliberalism being, you know, the progression of unregulated financial markets, so corporations can kind of monopolize on life and everything in it. But then, you know, the drug world is unregulated financial systems that don't go through governments and taxes, right? So it's quite ironic. But how that transpires is, you know, it's like Gabor Mate said, you know, the political undercurrent of the war on drugs has become a political rhetoric. But how that transpires into the individual is, you know, you can't wage war on an inanimate object. So you're waging war on society's most vulnerable people. And if you look at drug trafficking and where it all comes from, you know, the relationship between poverty and inequality that is driven strong relationships with neoliberalism and unregulated markets. It's, you know, it's a war on society's most vulnerable people. That's Gabor Mate's quote. So, you know, to think, you know, a bit more broadly as well. So, I mean, is society an incubator, you know, for addiction? Now, if we look at, you know, consumerism, if we look at kind of, you know, pleasure, happiness, you know, and it's possible to be miserable and experience pleasure. And pleasure and happiness are two different paradigms. And people denote happiness to pleasure because it's a pleasurable experience, right? And we are sold again and again and again, you know, through the commercialization of life and the commercialization of happiness, that it can be, you know, got in a bottle or a pill or for a new iPad or a pair of trainers. So drug addiction, you know, is an amplified version of the discontentment that we're living in and the not enoughness that we're consistently narrativized. And we're constantly uploading data in our head that has been narrativized and is strategically designed to develop impulses and you know, mold belief systems about ourselves that are inaccurate and not conducive to a harmonious human experience, right? And it's our discontentment that drives consumerism. You know, the neurological drivers from someone craving sugar are the same as someone that's smoking crack cocaine. So are we not all addicted in some way? Are we not all looking outside of ourselves to feel better, for a sense of ease and comfort?
And I think that's why it's Mate's definition of drug addiction is such a useful one, because it actually moves beyond specifying the use of drugs and alcohol, and so can be utilized from addictions with gambling, shopping, social media, work, sex, food, to name a few. The mechanisms of addiction to these various external sources is more or less the same, even though the consequences might be vastly different. So to give an example, I stopped using drugs when I went to university to study social work, but the same internal processes that drove me to misuse drugs also propelled me into workaholism throughout my 20s. And that had the advantage of being socially acceptable, even celebrated and rewarded with some real life positive effects. But it didn't alter the fact that it was a compulsion that I felt unable to regulate. And despite its benefits, it negatively impacted on my overall well-being and essential relationships.
So through socially constructed ideas about what is and isn't acceptable, we choose egoic strategies like othering to sustain and justify our own behaviour. And we recognise that when we offer this definition of addiction, it can deconstruct some of that. And I think it's important to know, you know, I'm aware, having worked in social care for over 10 years now in national roles and visited lots of local authorities and shared my story, and, you know, I'm aware of many social workers that have, you know, coping strategies that aren't conducive to the kind of life that they really want to live. And I'm conscious that what we may be sharing today might evoke something within you. And we just want you to know that we hear you and we get it, and it's okay to ask for help. You know, and I know social workers that have had drug problems, alcohol problems, compulsive relationships, gambling. And, you know, we are in a really stressful job and constantly on the receiving end of, you know, we can experience secondary trauma. So we just want to say that we recognize that what we're sharing here may evoke something within you. And we want you to know that we care about how you feel and we understand. And we encourage you to seek some help and a trusting relationship where you can be honest about the situation. So here we go. A human approach, right? So beyond rejecting people from society, confirming their negative belief systems about themselves, which is the engine that's driving all that behavior in the first place, you know, we need to think about constructing, you know, a humanitarian response to human suffering, you know, one that recognizes that there is a human being, you know, behind the behavior that come from innocence, and stuff has kind of got messed up along the way. Yeah. Now, you know, there's a few kind of perspectives here. So decriminalizing drugs is not legalizing drugs. Often I get asked this question, Ian, do you think we should legalize drugs? No, because I don't want to encourage people not to be with themselves more so than we're not now. But decriminalizing, I think, is a different narrative, you know, and perhaps decriminalizing drugs could be more conducive to recovery. I mean, I know my mind's gone blank at the minute. I didn't want it to go blank, Richard. It's like being in a police station all of a sudden. I forgot, Gov. I just forgot. I don't know. I'm insomnia. What's that country? Portugal. You know, they steered like 90% of. I mean, Johann Hari wrote a book called Chasing the Scream, where he deconstructed the war on drugs. And I actually met Johann Hari in Brighton on a bench eating chips not long ago, and we had a great conversation about this. Like, randomly met him, and. You know, and he said that they took 90% of their funding and put it towards rehabilitation and, you know, through the efforts of helping people rather than criminalizing them. And, like, you know, they kind of halved the problem. Like, the solution was, you know, the results were, you know, astounding. So, you know, and then that also feeds into sort of harm reduction. So, you know, like, I know that drugs are illegal, and if I've got the obsession to use drugs, I'm not going to go and not use drugs because they're illegal. You know, I'm not really subscribing to legalistic frameworks about human life in this country when I'm, you know, using drugs so I can bear to be alive with my suffering, because I'm escaping this deep sense of sadness inside of me that just feels so inconsolable. Like criminalizing it is not going to solve it. That's not strong enough. Do you want to say something on that?
Only that so before I was born, my dad went to a rehab centre and he achieved sobriety for the first time in his adult life. And he had drug-induced psychosis that caused him to be sectioned. He experienced outbursts of violence, and the legal consequences that he suffered as a result of his behaviour and his drug use did little, if not nothing, to deter him. However, once he decided to stop using drugs, he accessed a residential rehabilitation treatment centre that could offer him highly accepting, supportive, yet a challenging kind of support system and a programme to help him abstain. And notably, he was offered support to address or at least alleviate the intensity of the psychological distress associated with the rejection that he experienced from his mum, the unexpected separation from his father, and the childhood experiences of being in multiple care homes. And so this experience, what Gabor Mate refers to as an island of relief, afforded him with the greatest period of stability in his adult life, and allowed me and afforded me to have several years with my dad sober. And so whilst he did eventually relapse, and this did cause some difficulties, I've no doubt that those first several years were really crucial and beneficial for my development and my life outcomes. And perhaps it's part of the reason why I'm here today in the way that I am, and not following his footsteps to a kind of drug and alcohol induced early grave.
Yeah, and so the basic, you know, harm reduction holds the basic principle that some people are going to continue to use drugs and they're on a journey. So we need to think about how we can support safe passages through that journey. And the more we push against it and push it underground, then the more out of control it will get. And a culture of openness and honesty and care and understanding. And, you know, I think more people would, you know, achieve recovery and sustain recovery if we could manufacture environments that were more conducive for that.
And I suppose harm reduction is about encouraging or creating the possibility of helping people to feel better, and then bringing them into therapeutic relationships with caregivers, offering them a sense of trust, removing the judgment from our interactions with them. So it can in fact be a gateway into them accessing treatment, moving on. So to conclude, we have this quote by Gabor Mate.
We like Gabor Mate. Can you tell?
Have you noticed?
Yeah, we think he's all right. You know what I mean?
So there's no question that hardcore addicts are a challenging population to work with. Challenging because they trigger our judgments and anxieties, and because they threaten the comfortable self-image we've worked so hard to establish for ourselves as cool, competent and powerful professions. They stand quite outside the nicely ethic of respectable middle-class social interaction. So we recognise that in our attempt or endeavour to encourage a more compassionate response to working with those that suffer with addiction, that they can be extremely difficult to work with. My dad could be incredibly obsessed and selfish and self-centered, and his self-destructive behavior really compromised my relationship with him at times. So it's about recognizing that we can acknowledge that they're behaving in a way that's destructive for themselves, for other people, but that shouldn't in of itself preclude them from receiving a compassionate, humane response to the way that we support and help them.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'm part of a community that, of people who live with addiction and have, managed to achieve and maintain multiple years of abstinence-based recovery. And, some of the most sensitive, kind, caring, compassionate people I've ever met, who are deeply intuitive, deeply understanding, and for the majority come out with an authentic desire in their heart to want to help people who have had similar experiences to them. And as a result of that, go on to lead fulfilling, contributing lives. I want to tell you an example quickly. I was 4 years in recovery and I relapsed, and within 7 days I was injecting drugs and I was on the bedroom floor again in a mess. And a friend of mine, I phoned in the middle of the night and I said, listen, I'm done and I'm in a bit of trouble. And he came and picked me up. He took me to a recovery support group, and I'd injected heroin just before I met him, and I fell off the chair in the meeting, and he walked across the room and he picked me up and put me back on the chair, and he held me on the chair for the rest of that meeting, and he said to me, Ian, you haven't got to be frightened anymore, and together we're going to get through this. And about 3 or 4 days later, I've been doing 2 meetings a day and trying to get hope back in my heart. It was really difficult relapsing after years of recovery. And he phoned me, and on the 3rd day, and he phoned me, he said, how you doing? I said, you know what, I think I'm going to be okay. I can feel the hope coming back in my heart again. And he said to me, good, Ian, because I love you and I don't want anything bad to happen to you. And I said, you're going to make me cry? And he said, cry. And that permission he gave me, I just cried. And in that moment, there was a song on the radio by the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and it's a song called Don't Forget Me. And there's a line in the song, and the line was, in that moment, there's a love that knows the way. And for me, that was a spiritual awakening. What I realized was that even in the face of my own egoic strategies to prevent me from experiencing love, because, my neurological pathways tell me and central nervous system tell me it's too painful, but I knew in that moment my defenses were down, I was vulnerable, and I knew that love was the antidote to human suffering, connection, community, common unity. Anyway, sadly, my friend, he was a care leaver. He'd spent 20 years in prison. He was from Southeast London. He was a beautiful human being, and he relapsed because he had physical pain that meant the doctor prescribed him medicine that set off his obsession, his compulsion. He ended up back on street drugs and in prison. And sadly, he took his own life in prison. And, and I wouldn't be here without that man, Rob, God bless him. I wouldn't be here without him. He reached out to me. He got in the hole with me and he pulled me out the hole. And I want society to have a kind, caring, compassionate response to human suffering, because adversity doesn't always, discriminate. And what kind of people do we want to be? How do we want to respond to each other? And I believe we're going to look back at this time and go, did we really incarcerate people for suffering with addiction? Did we really do that? And we need to evolve the way we see people and change the narrative.
And I think that was just like a beautiful story that encapsulates where we were at the beginning when we were talking about compassion. Because in that moment between you and Rob, there was a suffering. He suffered with you. There was a togetherness that was able to cultivate a new way of being and a new possibility. And that's what I think is available through a different way and a different lens through the way in which we see those suffering with addiction.
So we've got 3 minutes. It's probably been the best hour of my day. There are some things we didn't cover, and because we've got an hour and we can't do a globalized systemic analysis on all the internal external factors relating to addiction and people suffering with addiction. But there's lots around theory, research, and linking this to practice. Motivational interviewing example is a popular theory to support people who want to change behaviors where there may be resistance. Policy and politics, that's a juicy one. Political rhetorics and their esoteric drug policies designed to sustain neoliberalism. As you can tell, I'm a little bit interested in that stuff. And the war on drugs and the relationship to globalization, neoliberalism, and pharmaceutical capitalists. And, there are politically influential people that make a lot of money from the war on drugs. And, for the sake of our integrity and social work practice and values, we can't, point your thinking in that direction, and not identify that stuff. And finally, in the last 2 minutes we've got, what we want to do is we just want to give a little shout out to this bad boy and girl, because books aren't gender specific. See, I had to catch myself there. Okay, I am still a human being guilty of being on a journey, by the way. There is no static accomplishment. I will forever be learning, thank God. So this book, do you want to say something about this book?
I think, well, both Ian and I've contributed in the book, but to be honest, even if we hadn't, I'd be recommending it because I'm about halfway through, and it's a remarkably impressive book documenting the experience of care for social workers who've had experiences in care. And it's got lots of vulnerability and a lot of generosity by the people that have contributed to kind of share their heart, share their difficulties, and offer us a kind of window and an opportunity to understand what their life has been like.
So, hidden narratives of care experience social workers, insiders, outsiders. There you go. So I think that wraps us up. We are 1 minute away. If you did like this and there's more thirst for it, I'm sure we can, probably do something else. Talk to Siobhan. But yeah, and, I just want to point you in the direction of a TED Talk that I did as well. It's called The Gift of Desperation. If you like TED Talks, where I kind of do a bit more of analysis of societal perspectives of addiction, and also Johann Hari's TED Talk, What You Think You Know About Addiction Is Wrong, and also Gabor Mate's TED Talk, The Power of Addiction and Addiction to Power. We love you in the context of why we're all here. Thank you, and happy days.
We'll hand it over to Siobhan. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's been brilliant. Somebody said at the beginning of the webinar, I love this pair. They need their own television program. And I've been thinking about it all the way through, and I've been thinking, yeah, it'd be brilliant, and honestly, the feedback in the chat that's just coming in now, the chat has been so quiet tonight. And you know why it's been quiet? It's because people have been listening to you so much. You've taken us on that emotion with you, really. And honestly, I got my red pen out. This is like my special red pen, because in my little reflective journal notebook here that I write everything in, if it's something I really want to pull out, I write it in, and it's in red. And there was so much that I got. And I think you said there, towards the end there, Ian, you said it's been the best hour of your day. For me, it's been the best hour of my week and the best hour of the month. I mean, I've just had such a lot of learning out of tonight. So thank you so much. It's been fabulous. Really helped me to think about some things very differently. I was really taken with some of the things that you said. So I'm definitely going to be in touch about some of it, because it really made me think. So thank you so much. And I know it did for everybody else too. And you can see the feedback coming into the chat now. So we want to know when you do get your own television programme, because it'd be a good one to watch. I think you've just got a real chemistry and stuff between you, which is great. So thank you ever so much. Could you just move to the final slide? Have you got the slide that says what we've got coming up? Is it there, just so that I can let people know that? Thank you. But whilst that's up there, just in case some people have got to dash off, and Dave will put in the chat the next couple of sessions so that if people want to register, next week we've got a session on interpersonal violence led by Andrew Payne, and then it'll be a team-led session where we're going to revisit moral injury. And you know, I was thinking about that moral injury context tonight in relation to the war on drugs and some of the things that social workers are being asked to do as part of that, and whether that might create a moral injury. And I'm going to just try and think about that a little bit more, and I will probably ask your expertise on that. But great session. So, but this is what we've got coming up for people. If you've got to dash off, you can register for them. But there's a couple of questions in the Q&A, if you don't mind me asking you them, if that's okay. I think they're really insightful questions, actually. So one question is, have you found it difficult to separate your personal and professional views of drugs? You know, they say as social workers, you can see a person in the individuals that you work with, you know, so i.e. you might see somebody, I don't know, you might see Rob, or you might see your dad, or you might see somebody in a person that you work with. Has that impacted on you? And how do you separate it out? And which is, it might be too difficult a question for right now, but is there anything you can sort of advise there on that?
I have something that comes to mind. It was when a parent that I was working with several years ago now, and she was suffering with heroin addiction, and she was an incredibly capable mother, an incredibly likable, kind of borderline charismatic individual, and but her addiction to heroin was completely compromising her ability to afford the children safe care. And I really wanted to offer her the kind of treatment that was available to my dad, because I knew that was what could cultivate some of the changes that I felt like she needed. But she just wasn't at a place in time where she was able to kind of receive that invitation to the support that we could make available to her. And so I had to bring that up into supervision about my own experiences, and what that I was projecting a little bit of what I would want my dad to have onto this mother. And because I grew up with a drug addict, perhaps I was also overlooking the potential harm caused to the children by her ongoing drug use. So my only kind of learning from that is about the using supervision as a mechanism to reflect upon your own experiences and the ways in which they filter and influence your assessment and your decision making.
Yeah, ironically, Siobhan, that's what my contribution was all about in your book.
It is actually, yeah, it is, absolutely, is that, yeah.
It's called the anti-oppressive practice is not an intellectual activity, and we're inspired and encouraged a lot to reflect on our practice, you know, but what about introspection and making an emotional inquiry into how we're emotionally responding to people, places, situations, institutions? I've been proper triggered. You know, being a social worker is the fast track to spiritual growth if you are a child of the state and have grown up in government care, you know. And what I can tell you, I could write a book on being triggered and transference. And I think that, you know, the strongest trigger I've probably experienced is representations of my mum, you know, and I project my relationship with my mum onto, you know, practice situations. And I feel deeply sad about my mum, and I try and honour my mum's life by feeling inspired by her adversity to support people. But then I have to recognise, you know, that people's right to self-determination, even in the face of unwise decisions, and manage my expectations. But, you know, I try and work hard to give them the opportunity. And working you know, in local authority, you know, isn't easy when we're supporting people with addiction, limited resources, and you know, you could see things a certain way and you'll probably get countersigned quite easy when it's really not the right thing. So, you know, I feel quite inspired by a lot of my stuff, but working in fostering has been a different kettle of fish. Working with foster carers that represent foster carers that I've had has been very, very challenging. And I've had to have some really honest conversations with my manager after an internal struggle and a process of surrender.
Yeah. You know, what's really interesting there is, and I mean, we could talk about this for hours, because also I have lots of images and thoughts about what you wrote in the book, you know, and what I learned from it. But both of you there talking about honest conversations with your manager, and I think that is really important, that we have to have that honesty, but we've got to have that relationship where we can have that honesty, don't we, and feel that we're not going to be judged by sharing whatever we want to share. Yeah. There's another question that actually links into that, and it's the final question, and I think it's really important you hear it, because it's from it says it's from an anonymous attendee, and it says, I am a huge fan of both Rich and Ian, and one of the main things I admire most about them is their openness and honesty. I'm still a social work student, and I'm really interested to know whether Rich and Ian believe it's possible for social workers to practice if they're active addicts. I have a very long-standing socially acceptable addiction with food, and I wonder whether there's a place for me in social work whilst I'm still caught in this addiction myself. Am I suitable to be a social worker? Thank you both.
Wow. Okay, I'm really grateful that you've asked that question. I'm really grateful that you showed up in that question and was honest about your situation. Look, you know, I mean, I've got a criminal record that's 96 pages long, and it's been a real battle getting qualified at times and getting through HR and placements and uni and governance panels. And what I can say about my experiences, in one thing, the thing that would make me quite unemployable in one lens actually makes me very employable in another. And, you know, I see my experiences as a terrible gift, you know, and I think that it's not what we do that's important. It's about how what we do impacts us and those around us. And, you know, I think what you have is an opportunity to have a deeper, meaningful engagement with yourself and, you know, go on a journey that is not for the faint-hearted, that is the road less traveled. And on the other side of that is something beautiful for you. And for the sake of my own integrity, to identify with you in this moment, I know that, and I'm saying that to you, but even as we speak in this moment, I know that I'm contending things within my personal life that I'm struggling to let go of, ways of thinking that keep me stuck, ideas about people, places, situations, and institutions. There's no static accomplishment. So I'm with you on this, you know, like we ain't got it boxed off. We frequently laugh about how, you know, troubled we are, you know, but it's, you know, and I recently had a real battle with my own integrity, you know, because I've struggled of late, you know, and I said to somebody, I've got no integrity. And he said, you have, Ian. Integrity is about taking honest steps towards healing yourself. And your question for me is an honest step towards healing yourself, and you have integrity. I'm at Ian Presents on Twitter. I'd love you to reach out to me and have a conversation, and I can offer you a confidential space.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I would have said something similar around integrity and being there and that relationship with yourself, that conversation with yourself, as well as that conversation with your manager. That stuff that's really important. Thank you so much for sharing what you've shared tonight. I know it takes a lot to share what you've shared tonight, and we really appreciate it and really appreciate what you've done. And you'll know that we're going to join you now to have a quick debrief. I suppose I'm saying that because I want the audience to know that we don't just say try then and leave it, you know, that we do work with the people who are our guests, because the audience are going to go now and they're going to think we've just gone and that's it.
They'll see me on Crime Watch tomorrow thinking, bloody hell, he reoffended on the strength of this, you know.
Yeah, Siobhan didn't look after him at all, and there was no conversation afterwards. It was all done. Yeah, no, we are gonna have a debrief. We do that, and we do work with our guests in lots of different ways behind the scenes as well, don't we? And we learn such a lot from you. So, but thank you ever so much to our audience. We're going to close things there for everybody. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again next week. One final thing though, Ian, is you've said twice tonight, you said I could write a book on that. What I'm going to say to you is the pair of you need to write a book together, and that's what you need to do. So there's the challenge for you. Thank you ever so much, everybody, and good night. Bye. Bye.